What would you do if every house in your neighborhood had its doors bricked up from the inside? That was the first question that flickered through Mark and Lisa's minds the morning after they moved into Maple Hollow. On the surface, the place seemed perfect: quiet streets, well-kept lawns, kids' bicycles left carelessly in driveways. At first glance, it was the sort of suburban dream neighborhood realtors like to call a hidden gem. The couple had been desperate to leave the city behind. After years of cramped apartments, endless traffic, and late-night sirens, the quaint charm of Maple Hollow seemed like salvation. Their new home was a modest two-story with peeling white paint and a broad front porch that sagged a little but felt welcoming nonetheless. They'd toasted their first night with cheap wine and frozen pizza, laughing about how the place smelled faintly of dust and old wood. But the next morning, Lisa noticed it. She had been walking their dog, Jasper, down the street, admiring the rows of near-identical houses. She waved at a man across the street trimming his hedges. He smiled back, polite but tight-lipped. When she reached the corner, she slowed down, frowning. Every single house she passed had its doors sealed. Not boarded up like during a renovation. Not locked. Sealed. The front doors were covered from the inside with thick layers of brick and plaster. You could see the outlines of where the doors once were, faint beneath the work. Some were flush with the siding, others crudely uneven, but the effect was unmistakable. Where there should have been entryways, there were only walls. Lisa's stomach turned cold. When she got back, she burst into the kitchen where Mark was unpacking coffee mugs. "Mark," she said, her voice trembling with an excitement that wasn't joy, "have you noticed the houses around here?" Mark looked up, confused. "What about them? They don't have doors." He frowned. "What do you mean?" "Ours has a door." "Yes, ours does." She swallowed, her throat dry. "But theirs don't. They're sealed up. All of them." Mark laughed nervously and brushed her off at first, muttering something about renovations or maybe a weird HOA rule. But when Lisa dragged him outside and made him really look, the color drained from his face. He saw it too. Every house on their street was shut tight from within, like the families had bricked themselves inside deliberately. And yet, the neighbors were out. Children rode bikes in the street, their laughter strangely muted. Women tended to gardens that bloomed unnaturally bright flowers. Men mowed lawns and waved in the same restrained, polite way. But no one went in or out of their houses. Not once. That night, Mark and Lisa lay awake listening. They had left their bedroom window cracked open. The air was still, too still. No cars passing. No dogs barking. Just silence. And then, faintly, the sound of footsteps. Lisa held her breath. Someone was walking through the street. Slow. Heavy. Deliberate. Mark shifted beside her, whispering, "Don't look." But she couldn't resist. She pulled back the curtain a fraction and peered out. A group of neighbors stood in front of their house. 10, maybe 12 of them. Men, women, even a child. They weren't talking, weren't moving. Just standing there. Watching the one house on the block that still had a door. Their door. Lisa's breath fogged the glass. One of the neighbors, a tall man with a crooked smile, lifted his hand and waved at her. The wave wasn't friendly. It was patient. Waiting. Lisa didn't sleep that night. Every time she shut her eyes, she saw the neighbors standing silently outside, their pale faces lifted toward her window, their polite smiles frozen in place. Mark, exhausted, eventually drifted off, but even in sleep he twitched, murmuring nonsense words that made Lisa's skin crawl. Jasper, usually a restless bundle of energy, lay stiff at the foot of the bed, his head resting flat against the floorboards, ears twitching toward the hum of silence outside. When dawn finally crept into the room, Lisa slid out of bed and went to the window. She held her breath before pulling the curtain aside. The street was empty. The neighbors were gone. For a moment she thought she'd imagined it all, that maybe the stress of moving had sparked some kind of hallucination. But then she noticed the grass. The dew-covered lawn in front of their house bore faint, dark impressions. Dozens of footprints pressed deep into the grass, circling their porch, facing the front door. She woke Mark with a shake, shoving the curtain open so he could see. He rubbed his eyes, stared for a long moment, and muttered, "Jesus Christ." Neither of them ate breakfast. The coffee sat untouched on the counter. They walked Jasper up and down the street, searching for normalcy, but what they saw only deepened their unease. Each neighbor they passed waved politely. The gestures were eerily identical, same rhythm, same calm smile, as though rehearsed. The people never stopped moving, never lingered, never spoke first. When Lisa offered a nervous good morning, the responses came in perfect unison, "Good morning," followed by the same mechanical smile before the neighbors went back to their strange, silent chores. It wasn't just that the doors were sealed. It was that no one seemed to need them. At one house, Lisa saw a woman watering bright red flowers that curled unnaturally, their petals too thick, too fleshy. At another, a boy pedaled a bicycle in a perfect circle around his driveway, never breaking pace, his face expressionless. A group of 3 men stood shoulder to shoulder mowing lawns at the exact same angle, their mowers humming in unison like a choir. Mark tried to joke. Creepy Stepford Wives stuff. Probably some cult YHOA. But his laughter was thin, brittle. That evening, when they returned home, Lisa tested a theory. She pulled out her phone and tried to call her sister. The screen froze. No bars. She checked the Wi-Fi, connected, but no internet. Mark tried his phone. Same result. They tried the television. Every channel showed the same static screen, a gray wash broken by faint flickering shapes that might have been faces, except when you leaned closer, they vanished. Lisa grabbed Mark's arm, whispering, "What if we're cut off? What if?" A knock at the door stopped her cold. Both of them froze, staring at the front door. The sound came again. 3 deliberate knocks, slow and patient. Mark swallowed. Maybe one of the neighbors just wants to welcome us." Lisa shook her head violently. "No. Look. None of them have doors. Why would they come to ours?" The knocking came again. Louder this time. Mark took a step toward the door. "We can't just ignore it." "Yes, we can," Lisa hissed, grabbing his wrist. Her nails dug into his skin. "We should." They stood there in tense silence. After a long pause, the knocking stopped. For a heartbeat, relief washed over Lisa, until she heard the soft scrape of feet shifting on the porch. Whoever it was hadn't left. Mark leaned close to the peephole. His shoulders stiffened. "What?" Lisa whispered. His voice was hoarse. "They're just standing there. All of them. Half the neighborhood. Just standing. Watching the door." Lisa's breath caught in her throat. Against her better judgment, she leaned toward the window beside the door and pulled the curtain aside a sliver. They were there. At least 20 neighbors stood perfectly still on the lawn, facing the house, eyes fixed on the front door. Their polite smiles had vanished. Their faces were blank now, stripped of expression, as if the act of smiling had been nothing but a mask they no longer needed. Lisa let the curtain fall and backed away, her voice a whisper that shook with terror. "Mark, why are they waiting at our door?" The hum of silence swelled in the house until it was deafening, vibrating in her chest like a warning. And outside, the neighbors stood patiently, like worshippers before an altar, as though they knew sooner or later the door would open. The neighbors remained outside for hours. Mark and Lisa watched from the upstairs window as the crowd simply stood there, unmoving, unblinking, their faces turned toward the house like sunflowers bending toward light. Every now and then, one of them would tilt their head, almost in unison, as if listening for something inside. Jasper growled low in his throat, the fur on his back standing on end, pacing from one end of the hallway to the other. "They can't just stand there all night," Mark muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "They've got to go home eventually." But Lisa noticed something unsettling. The homes didn't matter. Not a single one of the neighbors had retreated back through a door. When the sun finally dipped, and twilight painted the sky in heavy purples, the crowd didn't scatter. Instead, more people appeared, emerging from the shadows between the houses, slipping silently out of backyards, until the entire lawn in front of their house was filled with bodies standing shoulder to shoulder. Lisa pressed her forehead against the glass, whispering to herself, "Why us? Why this house?" Mark tried to be rational, tried to find an explanation that fit. Maybe this is some kind of initiation, like the way they bring in new neighbors. But deep down, he didn't believe his own words. That night, sleep was impossible. The neighbors didn't leave. They didn't move. Their blank faces stared up at the windows as if watching for any sign of motion inside. When Lisa dozed off briefly near dawn, she woke to the sound of scraping, the slow drag of fingernails against the front door. By the third day, Mark's resolve was cracking. He decided to investigate. "We can't just stay locked in here forever. I'll talk to one of them." "Just one." Lisa clutched his arm. "Don't. Please, Mark. If you open that door, something bad will happen." But Mark's stubbornness had always been his flaw. He strode to the front door, yanked it open, and froze. The neighbors hadn't flinched. Not a single head turned toward him. They still stared at the doorframe as though the door was closed, as though Mark didn't exist. He waved his arms, shouted, "Hey! What do you want from us?" Silence. No blink, no breath, no sound. Mark stepped onto the porch, his shoulders squared, forcing bravery he didn't feel. "I'm not playing games. Tell me what you want." Still nothing. But then Lisa noticed movement, small, subtle, but undeniable. Their eyes shifted downward, all at once, focusing not on Mark but on the threshold of the doorway. It was like watching marionettes all tilt their heads in unison, guided by an unseen puppeteer. Lisa grabbed Mark's arm and yanked him back inside, slamming the door shut. Her voice trembled, "They're not looking at you. They're looking at the door." For the rest of the day, the neighbors never moved, never blinked, their eyes fixed unwaveringly on the doorway. Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that the door itself wasn't just an entrance. It was something more. Something the neighbors wanted, but couldn't have. That night, they searched the house for answers. They tore through closets, rifled through the attic, ripped open boxes left behind by the previous owners. Finally, in the basement, they found something. Behind a stack of rotting cardboard boxes, there was a panel of wood that didn't match the rest of the wall. It was newer, brighter, freshly cut. Mark pried it away with a crowbar. Behind it was a second door. Not a normal door. This one was ancient, its surface a blackened wood that seemed to breathe in the light of the basement bulb. Strange symbols had been carved deep into its surface, spiraling patterns that seemed to move if you stared too long. And unlike their front door, this one wasn't bricked or boarded up. It stood there, waiting. The air turned colder, damp with a smell like earth and rot. Lisa's stomach churned as she whispered, "What is this?" Mark ran his hand across the carvings. His skin paled as he pulled back. "It's warm." And then, above them, came the sound. The neighbors outside had begun humming. It wasn't random. It was low, resonant, perfectly synchronized, vibrating through the walls, rattling the floorboards. A collective, droning hum that made Lisa's bones ache. The same hum she had heard faintly at night, only now, it was louder. unified. As if the entire neighborhood was singing to the hidden door in their basement. Lisa clutched Mark's arm, her voice barely audible. "Mark, I think this house was never supposed to have a front door." The humming grew louder. Dust shook loose from the ceiling. Jasper barked and whined, pawing frantically at the stairs as though begging them to run. And then the blackened door in the basement knocked back. The knock wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was soft, almost polite, yet impossibly deep, like the sound of knuckles rapping on the hollow chest of the earth itself. The vibration rippled through the basement, rattling the light bulb overhead until it swung on its cord. Mark and Lisa froze in place, staring at the blackened door as if it might burst open at any second. Jasper whimpered, his nails clicking frantically on the concrete floor as he darted between the couple and the stairs, desperate to escape the basement. Lisa's voice quivered, barely a whisper. "Mark, please, let's just cover it back up. Pretend we never found it." But Mark couldn't move his eyes away. Something about the door transfixed him. The carved spirals seemed to pull at his gaze, their lines shifting and curving even though he wasn't moving. He felt the strange warmth radiating from it again, not the warmth of sunlight or fire, but something thicker, like the breath of something alive just inches behind the wood. He reached out unconsciously, his fingertips brushing the surface. The instant his skin touched it, the humming outside grew louder. Every neighbor, in perfect harmony, seemed to feel the contact. Their voices rose, the tone vibrating so deeply the entire house groaned. The hum was no longer sound alone, it was pressure, pushing against the walls, filling the rooms, sinking into their bones. Lisa yanked his arm back, her nails digging into his flesh. "Don't touch it." Mark blinked, shaking his head as though coming out of a trance. He swallowed hard. It feels alive, Lisa. That's not just wood." Before Lisa could respond, the door knocked again. 3 steady raps. Slow. Deliberate. And in the silence that followed, Lisa swore she heard a voice, so faint she could barely make it out, muffled like someone calling from underwater. A woman's voice. "Let me in." Lisa staggered back, covering her ears. "Did you hear that? Tell me you heard that." Mark's face was pale, his lips trembling. "I heard it." They backed up toward the stairs, but as soon as they reached the bottom step, every single neighbor outside fell silent. The humming stopped abruptly, like someone cutting the strings of an orchestra mid-note. The sudden silence pressed down on them, heavier than the noise had been. And then, above their heads, floorboards creaked. Lisa froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Mark, that's inside the house." The two of them stared upward, listening as the slow, measured footsteps moved across the first floor. One step. Then another. Heavy, dragging, deliberate. Mark's mind reeled, every door and window was locked. They had checked. No one should be inside. Jasper barked, low and furious, his body stiffening as he faced the stairs. But he didn't run up. He stayed rooted, as though terrified of what was on the other side of the basement door. Mark whispered, his voice hoarse. "There's someone upstairs." Lisa grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the basement door to the outside. But when they reached it, their stomachs dropped. The door that had always been there, the ordinary exit that led to the backyard, was gone. Not boarded, not blocked. Simply gone. The wall was smooth plaster, as if no door had ever existed. Panic clawed at Lisa's chest. She pressed her hands to the wall, slapping it, scratching it, desperate to find a seam. No, this can't be happening." Mark grabbed her shoulders, trying to steady her. "Lisa! Listen to me, we need to stay calm." But Jasper's growl cut him off. The dog's gaze was fixed back on the ancient door in the wall. His teeth were bared, saliva dripping from his muzzle, his entire body trembling with terror. The wood pulsed. For the first time, Mark and Lisa saw it, not just felt it, but actually saw the door inhale, its carvings expanding as though it were taking in breath. And then it exhaled. A long, hollow sigh. The basement bulb flickered violently, shadows stretching grotesquely across the walls. The voice came again, clearer now, though still muffled. "Open the door. Let me in. I've been waiting." Lisa shook her head violently, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Mark, we can't stay here. We have to get out. We have to." The footsteps upstairs grew louder, moving directly above them. Dust rained down from the ceiling as something heavy dragged itself across the floor. The sound was wrong, it wasn't just walking. It was circling, as if pacing, waiting. Mark's hands trembled as he pulled Lisa toward the basement stairs. "We'll go up. We'll run for it. I don't care what's outside, we'll push through them if we have to." They climbed the stairs slowly, the air growing colder with each step. Jasper followed close, growling deep in his chest. When Mark reached for the basement door handle, his stomach knotted, because the humming had started again. But this time, it wasn't outside. It was coming from inside the house. The basement door creaked open, and the sound was unbearably loud in the silence. Mark held the knob for a moment longer than he needed to, his hands slick with sweat, before slowly pushing the door wide. The stairwell beyond was swallowed in shadows. The single hallway bulb that had been on earlier was out now, and the house above them loomed like a cavern of absolute dark. For a split second, Mark thought of turning back, thought of bricking the old door up again, nailing shut the basement entrance, and pretending none of this had ever happened. But the low, throbbing hum vibrating through the wooden frame above them pushed him forward. He had the dreadful certainty that whatever was upstairs already knew they were coming. Lisa's nails dug crescents into his arm. Her breath was shallow and uneven, tears streaking down her cheeks as she whispered, "Mark, please, something's wrong. This house, it isn't just old. It isn't just strange. It wants us here." Her words clung to him like smoke as they stepped into the first-floor hallway. The air was bitterly cold, so cold it burned their throats. The pictures on the walls, the cheerful prints of flowers and rolling hills Lisa had unpacked earlier that day, were warped. Not just tilted, but shifted, as though the frames had melted slightly, their images bulging outward, pressing against the glass. Mark could have sworn the flowers in one of the prints turned their heads toward him as he passed. The hum surrounded them now. It wasn't one voice, or even many, it was something deeper, an endless chorus, the kind that you don't just hear but feel inside your teeth, your ribs, your skull. Mark realized with horror that the sound wasn't in the house. It was the house. Jasper's claws scratched nervously against the hardwood floor as he moved ahead, his ears flattened, his body low. He growled at the staircase leading up to the second floor, where the darkness was thickest. Mark followed his gaze and froze. Something was standing at the top of the stairs. The shape was faint at first, little more than a shadow, but as his eyes adjusted, the figure sharpened. It was a man, or what looked like one. His posture was unnatural, shoulders hunched, limbs too long. He didn't move. Didn't breathe. Just stood there, watching. Lisa clutched Mark's hand, whispering so softly it was almost inaudible. That's one of them. From outside. The man with the crooked smile." Mark's stomach dropped. She was right. He recognized the face, though now it was stretched thin, skin pulled tight over sharp bones. The crooked smile was still there, but wider, cracked, splitting his lips as though he'd been forcing it too long. His eyes were pits, hollow, depthless, yet burning with recognition. The figure tilted its head, and the house shuddered around them, walls flexing inward as if breathing in tandem with it. Lisa staggered back, nearly tripping over Jasper, who barked wildly, his small body rigid with fury. The sound didn't disturb the figure. Instead, It raised one long finger and pressed it slowly against its lips in a gesture that was unmistakable. Silence. The humming stopped instantly. For the first time since the nightmare began, there was only silence. And in that silence, Mark realized something even more horrifying. Their house was the only one with a working door. The only house that still allowed passage. And now he knew why. It had chosen them. Whatever the thing was, whatever force bound the neighbors in their doorless prisons, it wanted Mark and Lisa as the threshold. They weren't living in a home. They were living in an entrance. The figure at the top of the stairs moved. It didn't walk so much as unfold, sliding one leg down the step, then another, in a movement too smooth, too fluid. Its crooked smile never faltered. Lisa screamed, her voice sharp and raw, and bolted toward the front door. She yanked at the lock, twisting, pulling, kicking at the wood, but the door didn't budge. It wasn't sealed like the others, it simply refused to open. Mark grabbed her hand, pulling her back just as the figure descended another step. Behind them, from the basement, came another sound. The knock. 3 steady raps. And the muffled voice, clearer this time, a woman's voice that dripped with hunger. "Open the door. Let me in. They're waiting." Jasper lunged forward, barking furiously at the figure, but the dog's small body suddenly froze mid-leap, as though caught in invisible hands. He yelped, twisting in the air, then was gently set back down on the floor. The figure tilted its head again, almost curious. Then it took another step down. Mark realized they were trapped between 2 impossibilities, the living shadow above, and the breathing door below. The house itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation, its walls pulsing faintly, plaster cracking in small veins as though blood beat behind them. Lisa clutched his sleeve, her eyes wide with terror. "Mark, what do we do?" Mark's mouth was dry, his thoughts scattered, but one terrible truth pressed itself into his mind, cold and undeniable. "You were right," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It doesn't just want us here. It needs us here." And from upstairs, the figure opened its mouth, though no sound came out. Instead, the entire house inhaled. The inhalation was deafening, though no air stirred. Curtains pressed against windows as though drawn inward, dust swirled into spirals midair, and the couple felt their lungs tighten, struggling against a pressure that wasn't wind but will. It was as if the house itself had taken control of their breathing, deciding when they could inhale, when they could exhale. Lisa gagged, clutching at her chest, her body trembling as though invisible hands were wrapped around her ribs. Mark staggered, pulling her close, both of them gasping shallowly, fighting to keep some fragment of control over their own bodies. The figure at the top of the stairs had not moved further. It didn't need to. Its mouth remained wide open, but the soundless inhale came from everywhere, the walls, the floor, the ceiling, even the hollow space inside their skulls. Mark could feel it pulling at his thoughts, tugging at his memories, as though the house wasn't just hungry for breath but for something deeper, more essential. He pressed his palms to his temples and shouted in desperation, though his own voice sounded muffled and far away. "Stop! What do you want from us?" For a moment, there was no answer, only the grinding silence of that terrible inhale. Then, from below, the basement door knocked again. Harder this time. Not polite anymore, but insistent, like fists pounding against the coffin lid. 3 raps, booming with unnatural strength. Lisa shrieked, covering her ears as the voice rose, no longer faint, no longer muffled. "Open the door. Let us out. Feed the house. Feed the house." The words rooted themselves into Mark's mind, burning there. He looked at Lisa, and the horror in her eyes mirrored his own realization. This house, this entire neighborhood, wasn't a place people lived in. It was a vessel. A cage. A feeding trough. The neighbors sealed inside their doorless homes weren't victims, they were sacrifices, willingly or unwillingly bound to keep whatever was beneath the basements contained. But their house was different. It still had an entrance. The old door below was the last opening, the last way in. And the house needed someone to open it. Lisa clutched at him, sobbing into his shoulder. "Mark, we can't, please, we can't let it out. Whatever's in there, it'll destroy us." Mark's thoughts raced, splintered. They couldn't go outside, the neighbors would never let them escape. They couldn't stay here, the figure on the stairs was descending, its crooked smile stretched wider, impossibly wide, splitting its face. And they couldn't open the basement door without unleashing whatever had been whispering, waiting, feeding on every knock. Jasper barked wildly again, but the sound was strangled, crushed into silence by the pressure in the air. The poor animal scrambled beneath the dining table, whining, his tail between his legs, as the hum returned in full force. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the neighbors outside. It was coming from the walls themselves. Lisa screamed as cracks split open in the plaster, jagged lines racing across the ceiling. From them oozed something black, not liquid, not smoke, but something in between. It slithered downward, filling the corners of the room like shadows made solid. The stench of rot hit them, thick and suffocating. Mark stumbled back, pulling Lisa toward the kitchen, desperate to find another way out. He threw open drawers, searching for anything, keys, a knife, anything at all. But the drawers were empty. Completely empty, as though the house had swallowed their belongings. The cabinets gaped open too, barren of plates, cups, food. Everything they'd unpacked just hours ago was gone. Lisa sobbed, her voice breaking. "It's erasing us. Just like the others. Mark, it's..." A thundering crash cut her off. The front door, their front door, slammed open, though no one had touched it. For one fleeting second, Mark felt hope surge through him. But that hope withered instantly when he saw what stood beyond. Not neighbors. Not people. Shapes. Tall, thin, wrong. They stood in the street where the polite men and women had once been, their bodies stretched and bent in impossible angles, their faces smooth and blank. They didn't step forward. They didn't need to. They only stood there, waiting, as though the open door wasn't for escape but for invitation. Lisa screamed, dragging Mark back toward the basement. "We can't go out there. They'll take us." Mark hesitated, staring between the open front door, the crooked smiled figure descending the stairs, and the ancient, breathing door beneath them. The house seemed to pulse with anticipation, tightening its grip around his lungs, his mind. It wasn't giving them choices. It was funneling them, herding them, like cattle toward slaughter. Lisa clung to him, tears hot against his neck. "Mark, it's making us choose." And then, as if in answer, the basement door rattled violently. The voice rose, no longer faint, no longer begging. "Open the door. Let us in. Or we'll come through you." The floorboards groaned as the crooked smiled figure took another step, now halfway down the stairs. Mark felt the walls closing in. His heart thundered in his chest, his thoughts unraveling. He realized, with dawning horror, that Lisa was right. The house didn't simply want them here. It wanted them to decide. And in the silence before the next knock, Mark knew the truth. One way or another, they were going to feed the house. The silence after the voice faded was unbearable. It wasn't peace, it was the kind of silence that comes before a scream, the stillness before a predator pounces. Mark's ears rang with it, his heart hammering so hard he could feel the pulse in his throat. The crooked smiled figure stood frozen halfway down the stairs, its mouth still open wide, inhaling not air but something deeper, something Mark could almost feel being stripped from him piece by piece. Lisa sobbed quietly into his shoulder, trembling so violently it seemed like her body might split apart from fear alone. The front door hung open, gaping wide like a wound, but beyond it there was nothing inviting. The figures outside had gathered closer, their smooth faces gleaming in the pale light of the street lamps. They didn't move toward the house, they didn't need to. They stood like sentinels, a wall of twisted silhouettes, blocking the path to freedom. It wasn't just the door that was a trap, it was every choice they thought they had. The basement door shuddered again. This time the pounding was relentless, frantic. Dust fell from the ceiling with each blow. Jasper whimpered under the table, tail tucked, his tiny body quaking. Mark's thoughts raced in a spiral of madness. If he stayed, the thing upstairs would take them. If they ran, the things outside would take them. And if they opened the door below. He didn't finish the thought. Lisa grabbed his face between her trembling hands, forcing him to look at her. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot from tears, but clear with something like defiance. "Mark. We can't do what it wants. Do you hear me? Whatever's down there, it's not trapped. It's being kept there. If we open that door, we're not letting it out into the world, we're letting it out through us." Her words sliced through the fog in his brain. He thought of the neighbors, those perfect smiles, those hollow eyes. Not prisoners. Hosts. That's why their houses were sealed. That's why no one ever entered or left. They had already chosen once, or someone had chosen for them. They had already fed the house. Mark's knees buckled under the weight of the realization. Then why us? Why our house? Lisa's grip faltered. Her voice was low, broken. Because we're the only ones left. Every other family already made their choice. And now it's our turn. The pounding at the basement door stopped suddenly. The silence was worse than the noise. And then came the voice again, softer now, almost coaxing, as though it sensed their hesitation. "Open the door. One of you must let me in. Or both of you will be taken." The crooked smiled figure descended another step. His body creaked like old wood with emotion, and the walls around him bowed inward as if straining to contain the shape. The floor groaned under his weight, though he didn't seem heavy. The sound was more like the house itself was afraid of him. Lisa dragged Mark backward toward the kitchen, toward anywhere that wasn't the basement, wasn't the stairs, wasn't the open door. Her grip was iron, driven by terror and desperation. But as they reached the back of the house, they froze. The kitchen windows were gone. Not boarded, not covered. Gone. The wall stretched solid and seamless, smooth where the frames had once been. The house had erased them just as it had erased the back door in the basement. Lisa collapsed against the counter, sobbing. "It's sealing us in. Mark, it's sealing us in with it." He pulled her close, fighting to keep himself grounded, though his own mind felt like it was fraying apart thread by thread. He couldn't think, couldn't plan, couldn't breathe without the hum vibrating inside his bones. He glanced at Jasper, still crouched low to the ground, his eyes locked on the basement door. The dog knew. Animals always knew. Whatever was behind that door was the true heart of this place. And then, the bricked walls of the neighbors' homes began to tremble. Mark and Lisa heard it, hundreds of knocks in unison, rattling from every direction. The houses weren't empty. Behind every sealed doorway, fists beat against the walls, desperate to be freed. Mark staggered to the front window and tore back the curtain. The faceless figures outside hadn't moved, but behind them, in the yards and driveways, more shadows swarmed. Shapes pressed against the glass of windows, clawed at the insides of walls. Lisa joined him at the window, her voice breaking into a horrified whisper. "They're not the neighbors anymore. They're what happens after." Mark's breath caught in his throat. He understood now. The brick doors weren't cages, they were tombs. The people hadn't sealed themselves in, the house had sealed them with whatever they had chosen to let out. They weren't victims, they were vessels. And soon, he and Lisa would join them. The crooked smiled figure finally reached the bottom of the stairs. It stretched one hand toward them, impossibly long fingers curling like talons. The humming grew to a fever pitch, rattling dishes from cupboards, shaking dust from rafters. And then the voice from below thundered louder than ever, so loud it split the walls. "Choose." The entire house shook violently, the floor beneath their feet cracking wide enough to swallow furniture. Jasper barked wildly, skittering toward the basement, and Mark realized with horror that the dog wasn't just barking, he was being pulled. The house was dragging him toward the old door. Lisa screamed, lunging for Jasper. "No! No, please!" Mark grabbed her, holding her back as the dog's claws scraped uselessly against the floor, his body sliding toward the trembling basement door. Jasper yelped, a sound so full of terror it broke Mark's chest open. And in that moment, Mark knew the house had never wanted them. Not really. It wanted their offering. Jasper's claws screeched against the floorboards, sparks of wood and dust flying as he was dragged closer and closer to the basement door. His panicked yelps tore through the humming, raw and desperate, the sound of a creature that knew it was being pulled toward death, or worse. Mark lunged, his fingers outstretched, brushing Jasper's fur for the briefest instant before the dog slipped further away, his body jerking in unnatural spasms as if invisible hooks had sunk into him. Lisa shrieked and pulled free from Mark's grasp, dropping to her knees to clutch Jasper's hind legs. Her knuckles turned white with the effort, her face twisted with anguish as she fought against the impossible pull. "He's our dog, Mark. He's our family," she cried, her voice breaking into sobs. Mark dropped down beside her, his hands closing around Jasper's trembling body. Together, they pulled, their muscles straining, veins bulging in their necks, but the house was stronger. The humming surged until it rattled the marrow in their bones, until the entire floor trembled like a living heartbeat. The crooked smiled figure at the bottom of the stairs tilted its head with a sickening creak, as though watching with amusement. Its too-wide grin twitched, stretching a fraction further, splitting the skin at the corners of its mouth. Bloodless cracks spread like dry porcelain. And then, with a sound like splitting timber, it whispered again, though its voice was only the echo of the one below. "Choose. One must feed the house." Mark's lungs burned with the weight of the command. His mind screamed with denial, this wasn't real, this wasn't possible, houses don't breathe, walls don't hum, doors don't hunger. But denial was a fragile shield, and it had already shattered. The truth pressed against him from all sides. They weren't fighting the house. They were inside of it, being devoured piece by piece. Jasper yelped again, and Mark's grip slipped on his fur slick with sweat. Lisa let out a howl of pure grief, pulling harder, her arms shaking as though they would snap under the strain. Mark looked into her eyes, saw the terror and love and desperation blazing there, and he understood the decision she would never make. She would rather be taken herself than let Jasper go. The humming deepened, dropping into a register so low it felt like the world itself was groaning. Cracks splintered through the plaster of the walls, dark veins spreading like a disease. The bricked-up doors of the neighbors' homes thundered louder, fists pounding in unison as though cheering the inevitable. And then the basement door began to open. The bricks rattled free from their mortar, tumbling inward as if sucked into a void. A darkness thicker than any shadow poured through the cracks, swallowing the dim light of the hallway. The smell that hit them was putrid and sweet, like rotting fruit left too long in the heat, but layered beneath it was something older, something metallic and sharp, the scent of earth torn open too deep. Lisa screamed, wrapping her arms fully around Jasper, clinging to him as though she could shield him with her body. "No! You can't take him. Take me instead." Mark froze at her words. The air seemed to pause, the humming faltering, listening. The crooked smiled figure leaned forward, its body creaking like an old tree in the wind, its grin quivering with anticipation. The voice from below rolled through the house, heavy and suffocating, filling every space, every breath. "You offer yourself? Then you understand the law. The house must feed. Lisa sobbed, pressing her face into Jasper's fur. "Please, just let him go." Mark's chest constricted so violently he thought his ribs might splinter. The thought of losing Lisa, of watching her vanish into that darkness, tore him apart in a way words could never hold. But before he could speak, before he could bargain, the floor beneath them buckled. Jasper was wrenched from their arms, ripped away so violently that Lisa was flung backward across the kitchen floor. Her body struck the cabinets with a sickening crack. Mark's scream was drowned in Jasper's final, terrified howl as the little dog was pulled through the opening door. For one last glimpse, Mark saw Jasper's wide, glistening eyes staring back, pleading, before the darkness swallowed him whole. The door slammed shut, the bricks knitting themselves back into place with a wet, grinding sound. Silence fell. Lisa crawled forward on her hands and knees, fingers clawing at the floor where Jasper had been. Her nails broke against the boards, smearing red across the wood. She screamed his name again and again, the sound ripping from her throat until it was hoarse. Mark collapsed beside her, his entire body trembling, tears streaming down his face. He tried to touch her shoulder, but she shrugged him off, curling into herself, rocking as though cradling an invisible weight. The crooked-smiled figure stepped fully into the room now, its shadow stretching impossibly long across the floor. It leaned down, its cracked face hovering inches from theirs, the grin so wide it looked ready to split its head in two. Its voice was a whisper that slithered into their ears, soft but undeniable. "The house has eaten. But it is never full." Mark's stomach twisted violently, bile rising in his throat. He wanted to scream, to rage, to tear the house down with his bare hands, but all he could do was sit there, empty, broken, watching the cracks in the walls pulse with faint light, as though the house itself was breathing deeper now, satisfied, for the moment. And then the floor began to tremble again. The silence after Jasper's disappearance was worse than the humming had ever been. It wasn't peace, it was the kind of silence that comes after a scream, when the air still vibrates with the memory of sound. Mark sat on the floor, his face buried in his hands, unable to breathe properly, his body trembling with shock. Beside him, Lisa rocked back and forth, whispering Jasper's name in a broken loop, as though saying it often enough might stitch him back into existence. The house itself seemed to inhale slowly, its walls flexing outward with a deep groan, then pulling back again like ribs around a monstrous set of lungs. Mark forced himself to lift his head, his vision blurred with tears and exhaustion. He focused on the crooked-smiled figure, still standing there in the kitchen doorway. Its grin had grown wider, impossibly so, splitting its cracked face nearly to the ears. Bloodless fissures ran up its cheeks like shattered porcelain. When it spoke, its words weren't meant to be heard, they were meant to be obeyed. The first law, it croaked, tilting its head, is that the house must eat. The second law is that the house must remember. Lisa's whispering stopped. Her swollen eyes snapped open, confusion and terror mixing in them. What does that mean?" she asked, her voice fragile and childlike. The figure's grin twitched. "Look to your walls." Mark followed its gaze and felt his stomach turn to ice. The photographs. Every hallway, every room, every surface in this house had been covered with old photographs since the moment they'd arrived. They had chalked it up to eccentricity, to history, to something quaint about the neighborhood. But now, the pictures were moving. He staggered to his feet, dragging himself toward the nearest frame. It was a photo of their first day in the house, one they hadn't taken. There they were, standing at the gate, Lisa holding Jasper's leash. But as Mark stared at it, the picture began to ripple, like heat over pavement. Jasper's form wavered, and then vanished completely. The leash hung loose in Lisa's hand, empty. "No," Lisa choked, scrambling forward. She tore the frame from the wall, but the photograph didn't change. She flipped it over, clawed at the back, ripped the paper free, but the image remained burned into the glossy surface. Jasper had been erased, as though he had never been theirs. Mark turned to the other photos. Their wedding picture in the hallway, Jasper wasn't there, though he had been in the original, sitting at their feet with a ridiculous bow tie. A picture of them at the park, the space beside Lisa was blank, her arm hanging in the air as though resting on a phantom. Every image in the house had rewritten itself, memory by memory, until Jasper was gone. The second law, the figure repeated, stepping closer. Its voice had grown stronger, as though each word was sinking hooks into their minds. What is taken must also be forgotten. The house keeps the memories for itself. You will live without them. Lisa shook her head violently, clutching the ruined photograph to her chest. No. I won't forget him. I won't let you take him from me like he never existed. But even as she screamed it, her voice faltered. She blinked rapidly, pressing her free hand to her temple. Mark, her face twisted in panic. What color was his collar? Was it blue? No, it was red. Wasn't it? Mark, her voice broke into sobs. I can't remember. Mark grabbed her shoulders, shaking her gently, desperately. It was red, Lisa. Jasper's collar was red. We bought it the day we picked him up, remember? You said the blue one didn't match his eyes. His voice cracked, pleading not just with her but with the house itself, as if he could hold the memory in place by sheer force of will. But the house didn't care. The humming swelled again, vibrating through the photographs, through the floor, through their bones. Mark pressed his forehead against Lisa's, both of them clinging to a memory that was slipping away like sand through trembling fingers. And then, with a final pulse from the walls, it was gone. Lisa froze. Her sobbing stopped. She stared at the torn photograph in her hands with blank eyes. Who are we talking about? She whispered. Her fingers opened, letting the picture flutter to the floor. Mark felt the air leave his lungs. His body went cold, colder than he'd ever known. She didn't remember. The house had erased Jasper from her completely. And as much as he tried to summon the image of Jasper himself, the shine of his coat, the shape of his ears, the sound of his bark, he realized he couldn't recall it clearly either. His own mind was betraying him. The crooked smiled figure straightened, satisfied. This is the way. The house eats. The house remembers. You forget. And soon, it paused, tilting its head so sharply the sound of cracking bones filled the air. You will forget even yourselves. Mark's knees buckled. He dropped back onto the floor, shaking, staring at the countless photos covering the walls. He suddenly saw them not as history, not as decoration, but as tombstones. Each face, each frozen smile, each empty space where someone should have been, these weren't just pictures. They were the record of the house's meals, an endless archive of what it had consumed. And there were hundreds of them. Lisa sat silently beside him, her eyes hollow, her shoulders trembling. She rubbed at her arms as though cold, though sweat still clung to her skin. Mark, she whispered. Why do I feel like something's missing? Like I'm grieving, but I don't know for who. Mark couldn't answer. He only reached for her hand, clutching it tight, terrified that one day he'd wake and not remember who she was either. The humming swelled around them, almost triumphant now, and the figure's smile split into an unholy fissure. The house is never done, it whispered. The house is waiting for the next meal. And if you cannot choose, it will. The walls shuddered, a low groan rolling through the beams. The photographs nearest to them began to ripple again, not erasing this time, but shifting. Mark felt bile rise in his throat as he realized the newest images were forming. Blurry, but unmistakable. It was them. Him and Lisa. Their photographs had already begun. Mark's throat was raw, his body trembling as though his muscles had been wrung dry. He clutched Lisa's hand so tightly that her knuckles turned white, afraid that if he let go, even for a second, she would fade the way Jasper had, erased piece by piece until he no longer remembered who she was. The photographs on the walls were no longer static. They rippled, shimmered, shifted, each glossy surface alive with unnatural movement. The newest ones showed him and Lisa standing in the house, captured from impossible angles. The images warped as they watched. Sometimes Lisa's face blurred away, sometimes Mark's body vanished, sometimes they stood alone in the pictures, reaching for someone who wasn't there. Lisa's voice was a whisper of dread. "It's taking us already." She raised a trembling finger toward the wall where one photograph now showed her kneeling in the kitchen, just as she had earlier when she'd clutched Jasper. But in this version, she was alone. Jasper was gone. And so was Mark. Her own body was bent in grief, crying for something no longer remembered. Lisa covered her mouth with her hand, stifling a scream. The crooked smiled figure's shadow swelled, stretching across the floorboards like tar. Its head tilted at that unnatural, bone-snapping angle, its grin a wound splitting wider with each passing second. The third law, it rasped, each syllable vibrating through their skulls, is that the house must finish what it starts. The bricked-up doors throughout the neighborhood thundered then, shaking in unison. Mark and Lisa could hear them, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, pounding from the inside. Desperate hands, fists, and bodies hammered against the walls as muffled voices howled from behind them. It was no longer polite waving neighbors outside. It was the trapped, the forgotten, the eaten, but not erased. Their sounds filled the block, an orchestra of the damned. Lisa clung to Mark, her nails digging into his arm. "They're still in there," she whispered. "The people this house took, they never left." Mark forced himself to his feet, dragging Lisa with him, though his body screamed with exhaustion. "There has to be a way out," he muttered, though his voice trembled. He staggered toward the front door, their only door, the one thing that set their house apart from all the others in this cursed neighborhood. He grabbed the handle, yanked with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. The door didn't even rattle. It wasn't locked. It simply wasn't a door anymore. The wood was warm beneath his palms, pulsing with a faint rhythm, as though it were skin stretched taut over something alive. Behind him, Lisa gasped. "Mark?" He turned and saw her pointing at the photographs again. His stomach dropped. The images no longer showed vague distortions. They were sharp, clear. One frame showed Mark pounding on the door in desperation. Another showed Lisa cowering on the kitchen floor. Another showed them together, clutching each other in terror. And in each successive photo, they were further gone, their outlines fading, their eyes hollowing, their bodies dissolving into the background like stains soaking into the paper. The crooked smiled figure stepped closer, its cracked face inches from theirs. The smell of dust and rot poured off it. "There will be no escape. You belong to the house now. Soon, you will be forgotten. Soon, you will be remembered only here." It gestured with one twitching hand at the walls lined with photographs. Lisa shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. "No. I won't end up like them." She tore herself from Mark's grip, rushing toward the bricked-up basement door. Her fists pounded against the mortar, blood smearing across the stone. "You hear me? I won't let you have me." The house groaned in response, the humming so loud now it rattled the glass in the frames. The bricks of the basement door shuddered, cracked, and then split apart with a deafening roar. Dust billowed into the air as the door yawned open, revealing the same black void that had swallowed Jasper. The air that poured out of it was frigid and foul, stinking of decay and wet soil. Lisa staggered backward, but before Mark could reach her, the floor beneath her feet cracked. Boards splintered like dry bone, and she plunged waist-deep into the opening. Mark screamed her name, lunging forward, grabbing her arms as the darkness clawed at her legs. The crooked smiled figure loomed above them, its grin splitting wider, bloodless cracks tearing its cheeks apart until its head seemed barely held together. "The house must finish," it hissed. Mark pulled with all his strength, veins bulging, muscles tearing, but the darkness was stronger. Lisa's fingers slipped through his, her nails scraping his palms until she was gone. Her scream echoed once, twice, and then was smothered. The boards snapped shut, leaving nothing but silence and the faint hum of satisfaction. Mark collapsed onto the floor, sobbing, his hands clutching at the empty space where Lisa had been. His body shook violently, his vision blurred by tears. And yet, as he wept, he realized with growing horror that her face was already blurring in his mind. Her voice, her laugh, the curve of her smile, they were slipping away. He slammed his fists against the floor, screaming her name, but the sound of it felt strange, hollow, like a word he had just learned. He stumbled to his feet, desperate, wild, searching the walls for her. And there she was, in the photographs. Dozens of them, hundreds of them, showing her face fading, her body dissolving, her presence erased until nothing remained but him. Just him, alone, surrounded by endless smiling neighbors in their frames. The crooked smiled figure stepped into his vision one last time. Its face was no longer even human, just a jagged grin carved into cracked porcelain. Its voice filled every corner of the house. "You are the last door." The walls shuddered violently. The photographs of Mark shifted, moving faster, as if flipping through the pages of a book. In one, he stood screaming at the void. In another, he clawed at the locked door. In another, he curled on the floor, his face hollow and blurred. And then, in the final one, there was nothing at all. The humming stopped. The silence was absolute. And outside, in the neighborhood without doors, the houses stood still, their windows glowing faintly in the night. Neighbors waved politely from behind their curtains, their faces frozen in smiles, as if nothing had ever happened. As if no one had ever lived in the house with the last door. Inside, the walls were lined with photographs. Smiling faces. Blurred edges. And one more space left empty, waiting for the next.